Remember, faith is it's not about when you arrive, it's about the fact that you do arrive. And oftentimes in faith, the first step is probably the most difficult, which makes the last step the sweetest, and all the steps in between the most critical. And so that's kind of what we've been walking through. We've been walking with a guy in the Bible who is the father of faith. Many of you know him. You've heard stories about Abraham from the time that you were knee-high to a grasshopper. But we are learning all kinds of new information about Abraham that maybe we've kind of just glazed over, or as we read the story, we read it too fast and we don't grab applications. And so I just want to say that's kind of what you're a part of today. We are in chapter 18, and what we've seen so far with faith and what faith kind of brings us to, faith brings us to areas of famine and areas of war, areas of conflict, crisis with each other sometimes. It also, in this thing that we call faith, it seems like it's full of twists and turns, and sometimes you don't know whether you're taking the right step or the wrong step, the left step or the right step, but faith has a way of just kind of mapping itself out in some regards. And it's full of regrets. Faith can be full of wrong decisions and things that you wish that you had never got yourself into. Again, the most important thing, though, is that you continue to step forward, step closer to Christ. So you can take a couple of steps forward and one step back. Just keep moving forward. Just keep following Jesus. Last week, what we learned is that faith really, in all of faith, what faith does is it brings us to our knees. And so we learned about Abraham's circumcision last week. We learned about that he had been given this promise, but now for the first time in about 25 years after he had been given that initial promise until that time in 17, we're actually going to have a little skin in the game. We're going to actually have something to do with this thing that we call faith. And so today what we're going to learn, I think, is that faith can be full of surprises. It could be full of unexpected visitors from time to time. And it's full of characters that we don't know. And so it's really important for us to really understand faith at a macro level, at a 30,000-foot view, what we're a part of. Because in a land filled with chaos and fear and hostility, our faith is best put on display by love and peace and hospitality. And so that's really what we're going to talk about, is a little bit of hospitality. We're going to talk about what it means to practice hospitality. In Hebrews chapter 13, verse 2, the writer of Hebrews says this: remember to practice hospitality. It's not an afterthought. This isn't like by the way, this isn't and if it's convenient. This is, don't forget how important hospitality is in the kingdom. Don't forget how practical hospitality really is for the believer. So remember to practice hospitality. For by doing this, by loving strangers, some have actually entertained angels and not known it, is what the verse goes on to say. And so this is a direct correlation back to the chapter that we're reading in Genesis 18. We're going to learn all kinds of neat stuff in this chapter that maybe you've just not seen before, especially when you were 8 years old in VBS. There's some real practical things with this passage that I am absolutely excited to be able to share with you. But I can't really start this without telling a story about myself first. And that's not because I'm, self-centered. It's just this really became real for me probably 15 years ago for the first time. See, I grew up in northern Missouri, right? And so my idea of hospitality was always having a pot of coffee on, so that when your third cousin once removed came over for coffee and cookies, you were ready for him or her, right? How many of you are familiar with that sort of style of hospitality? Most of you are, because you're Midwesterners, right? Some of you aren't Midwestern. Some of you are strangers, and we love you anyway, all right? But for most of us who grew up in the Midwest and grew up in the country, of course, hospitality just means having a pot of coffee on or having, some water on the table. That's what hospitality is limited to. And for me, hospitality became more real and became more tangible when I moved to Minnesota. So we moved in 2005. My family, we were younger then and had, I think Madison was 5 years old when we first moved. She's 19 now today, so that was 14 years ago. When we moved, there were, of course, some people on the edge that we knew because of the church. One of the people who came to our church was our neighbor right across the road. The associate minister when I came, he also was my neighbor right across the road. So we thought about renaming that street Church Street, just because how many people were from the Kimball Church there. I've told you the story about my cantankerous neighbor to the north before, and if you've not heard that, ask me sometime. I'll share about that cantankerous neighbor. But the one neighbor I'm going to talk about today is the one that lived to the south. And he's the sort of neighbor that when you saw him, you kind of made sure, okay, 1, 2, 3, 4. Yeah, we got all of our kids here. All right, good. Right? You just kind of kept an extra eye on your neighbor. And it wasn't because he was mean. It wasn't because he was nasty. It's because he was different. This sort of neighbor was Muslim. And he was Arabic. I mean, like Arabic, right? And when his mom and dad came to town, I mean, they had the whole sheets and eyes thing going for them. And I'm from Missouri. I mean, I know people like that. And those are the guys that bombed us in 9/11. So you load your guns and you make sure that you're protected at night, right? I mean, that's just what you do. And what I started to learn is we don't have to be that hostile with each other. Now, there's all kinds of conversations that I would love to have with you regarding Islamic faith and Christianity and how those two are in direct competition for each other. I will be very open about that. And I can share with you all kinds of reasons why I'd love to have coffee with you. But that's not the point of this story. The point of this story is that when I started to learn what hospitality was, it involved my friend who was a Muslim named Hassan. Hassan and I developed a very strong relationship. We were, by all terms of the definition, friends. We were different, and he grew up Muslim, and I grew up Christian. I was a pastor, and he kind of practiced, but not really. But Hassan was the sort of guy that would make you very uncomfortable. And we would end up, the very first time this ever happened, like where I kind of started to see my guard come down, was how he interacted with my children. Because he wasn't hostile towards my kids. He was very friendly towards my kids. I mean, like, weirdly so. I thought that, we were going to have some issues, but Grace was out playing in the yard one day, and she came in, Mandy and I, this is within the first week, and Grace and I, Mandy and I were upstairs putting some stuff together in our bedroom, and Grace came running up, and she said, "I just met Hassan." And I'm like, "Well, you did? What?" And we started to exchange cookies and recipes and food and culture and customs, even service. He would come over and plow my garden, and when I didn't have a tiller and the 2 or 3 seasons that his tiller broke, I went over and tilled his garden. I would actually end up marrying his sister-in-law in a wedding. We still have very, very good conversation. Hospitality is a love towards strangers. It is not a love towards your neighbor. We got to be very clear about that as we walk through Genesis chapter 18. So if you'd like to turn your Bibles to Genesis 18, here's basically what we're going to do today. I'm going to share with you observations, things that are just kind of wow factors in this passage. This is the geeks, the people who love Bible and have been told this story since they were 7 years old. You're going to really freak out on this passage or on this section, the observation section, because there's some really cool stuff in here. Okay? And then I'm going to share with you some direct parallels, some symbolisms that this passage points us to. It both points us backwards and forwards, and I'll get into that here in a second. Then we'll talk about some lessons that we're going to learn, and after we talk about the lessons, I want to share with you some practical applications. So that's kind of the if you're an outline person, that's kind of what we're doing. 1, 2, 3, 4, observations, parallels, lessons, and applications, all right? And then I've got one thing for you at the end to remember. So let's dive in. Genesis chapter 18. Genesis 18 begins with the Lord appears to Abraham. The Lord appears to Abraham near the great trees of Mamre. Now, if you're one of my old school friends, one of my KJVers who's watching or listening here today, yours is not going to say Great Trees of Mamre. Yours is going to say the Great Plains of Mamre. I'll deal with that here in a second. But as we walk through this passage, if you're KJV, just know that there's going to be some very significant differences in what you hear me say and what your Bible says. There's some education here to be done. But the Lord appears to Abraham near the great trees of Mamre, or the great plains of Mamre, while he was sitting at the entrance of his tent in the heat of the day. Now Abraham looks up, and he saw 3 men standing nearby. When he saw them, he hurried from the entrance of his tent to meet them, and he bowed low to the ground. He said, "If I have found favor in your eyes, my Lord, do not pass your servant by. Let a little water be brought, and then you may all wash your feet and rest under this tree. Let me get you something to eat." Again, my old school friends, you guys have a little morsel to eat, all right? That's what yours says. So that you can be refreshed. If you're KJVer, it would say, so that your hearts might be comforted. Okay, so refreshment is a direct correlation with being hearts comforted and refreshed. And then you can go on your way. Now that you've come to your servant, very well, these visitors say, do as you say. So Abraham hurries to his tent to tell Sarah, "Quick, get 3 seahs of fine flour and knead it and bake some bread." Then he ran to the herd and he selects a choice, tender calf, and he gave it to the servant who hurried to prepare it, and then brought some curds. If you're KJVer, that would be butter. Okay, that's what it means. Then he brought some butter and some milk and the calf that had been prepared, and he set them before them. Now, while they ate, he stood over them under a tree. That's just awkward, right? That's just weird, right? Can I get you anything else? So he's standing there. Abraham is standing there. "Where's your wife, Sarah?" they ask. "There in the tent," Abraham says. Then the Lord said, "I will surely return to you about this time next year." Now, if you're KJV, it says according to the time of life, okay? We're not real certain what this means. It could mean 9 months later. It could mean next spring I'll be here. It could mean next year. So there's some question marks on that phrase. But about this time next year is how the NIV does it. "And Sarah, your wife, she's going to have a son." Now Sarah was listening at the entrance of the tent, which was behind him. Abraham and Sarah were already old and well advanced in years. Sarah was past the age of childbearing, so Sarah laughed to herself as she thought, "After I am worn out and my master is old, will I now have this pleasure?" Then the Lord said to Abraham, "Why did Sarah laugh and say, 'Will I really have a child now that I'm old?' Is anything too hard for the Lord? I'll return to you at the appointed time next year," same phrase as before, "and Sarah will have a son." Now Sarah was afraid, so she lied and said, "I did not laugh." But he said, "Yes, you did. Yes, you did." So let's walk through some of these observations that I think are just kind of, that I geek out on, just because, I've been in the Bible a long time, and I've heard these stories from the time I was a kid, and some of you have too. First thing I want to share with you is that the Lord appears. This is the 6th time that the Lord appears to Abraham. This is the 6th time in about 25 years that God comes and has an interaction with him. As you read the Hebrew narrative and as you look at the original language, there's an abrupt sentence structure that's kind of formed. I mean, it's a weird, choppy sentence structure, and because of that, most commentaries would suggest that they appeared kind of out of nowhere, all right? Another significant thing here is that in verse 2, it says that Abraham looks up. Remember where Abraham's sitting. Abraham is sitting underneath the great trees, right? Or the great plains, depending on how you see it. Regardless of which one you see, both can be interpreted in the same breath. I believe what's happening is in Mamre, it's a great plain with a cluster of trees. I think that's kind of what's happening in this scripture. And in this specific geographic location, you can see for literally miles. So for Abraham to be in this spot indicates that he's in a spot of defense. Now, why would he be in a spot where he's defensive? Why would he be in a spot where he's making sure he can see where people are coming from? It's because of what we just read last week. Remember last week what just happened? He just was circumcised, and not only was he just circumcised, but his son Ishmael, which I wonder how he convinced Ishmael to do that at 13 years old. But at any rate, he convinces Ishmael, and the rest of the men of his kind of organization of his trained men, the 318 that we've read about in the past. Abraham's very convincing, right? He's definitely a leader. There's no doubt about it. So through this, he's influenced his people, and because they're in a vulnerable spot, because they've all been circumcised, then what happens is he's in this spot where he's looking and scanning the territory. He's wondering, is someone going to come? I think that's why he's sitting out in this spot of defense, okay? But the other thing that's interesting to me is that from a timeline standpoint, we're 450 years from the flood. 450 years from the flood. For there to be any trees would be remarkable. Not just remarkable, but kind of like, okay, that's rare. Like that's cool, there's some trees here. Why? Because the entire landscape of the known world was destroyed, utterly destroyed. So for there to be tree growth or significant tree growth would be substantial. But to have great trees in the plain of Mamre would be more than just significant. It would almost be a place of tourist attraction. I mean, it would be where people went for summer vacations. Have you guys seen the great trees of Mamre yet? I mean, they are huge. They're the biggest trees in the world. I'm convinced of it. So this is a very significant place. So not only does it show us that Abraham is in a spot where he can scan his territory, where he can see things and he's defensive, but he's also in a spot where he can start to rest and recover from what he's just gone through, right? So this is a place of peace, this is a place of shade and a place of shelter. Remember, it says in verse 1, while he was sitting at the entrance of his tent, when? In the heat of the day. So he's in a spot of kind of relaxation and rest and shade. And that's what trees do for us. Trees are that iconic place where we just can kind of daydream, where we feel safe, where we feel protected. Some of my favorite things to do is to find a huge cottonwood or a huge tree and just climb it and just be in it. And I don't know if it's something that's instinctive or primitive in who I am, or I don't know if you even connect with that idea, but I love climbing trees. I used to love climbing trees as a kid, especially big trees. It was a challenge because it keeps you safe. Now, let's jump to verse 10 through 12. This is just weird to me. I just love the humanity of what I'm about to see, or what you're about to see. So then the Lord said, I'll surely return to you about this time next year, and Sarah, your wife, will have a son. We read this part. Remember where Sarah is. Sarah's listening in the tent. She's not a part of this conversation. She's inside, and she's got her glass to the tent wall, right? She's really curious who these people are, and she's wondering what the conversation is about. And as these visitors come and say, hey, this time next year I'm going to see you, and your wife's going to have a son, she starts to laugh. Now, that's probably the only audible noise that she makes. And I don't think the laugh was hilarious knee slap laugh. I think this is more of a scoff laugh because of the response. Because earlier in chapter 17, we saw Abraham have the same sort of response. But his wasn't reprimanded. His was kind of like, really? We're really going to have a kid? When I'm almost 100 and she's almost 90? That's awesome. I think that's Abraham's attitude. Whereas Sarah's attitude is very different. Hers is almost like mockery, irritation. Ladies, can you relate? Yeah, you get a little irritated. I know, your husband knows too. I'm just kidding. I love you, right? But this is one of those scoff laughters that, yeah, whatever. I'm just irritated at this point. That's what's happening with Sarah. But the greater truth in that, this is the first time she hears it, which means Abraham hasn't said anything. Why didn't Abraham say anything yet? It's pure speculation at this point. I have no idea. I don't know why Abraham hasn't shared this great, wonderful news with his wife. Other than maybe he anticipates she's a negative Nelly. I don't know. That's for you guys to figure out. It could just be that he's not entirely sure either. And at this point, have they been intimate yet? And if they haven't been intimate, how do you have that conversation, especially with something changing? I mean, she's got to know, right? But regardless, this is a very unique situation because her private thoughts become public expressions. In our home, what we call that is your face went off. That's what we say, right? So if we're sitting around and we have visitors, or we're sitting around and a subject comes up, and that face, we even do this in the staff meetings. Our face goes off a lot in staff meetings. And it's typically because of something Gary says, right? We're like, Nancy, your face went off again. Yeah, I know. I'm sorry. But did you hear him? Yeah, I get it. Got to start playing some poker because we don't know how to control our public expressions. Our private thoughts are coming out again, right? That's what happens when your face goes off. And you kind of expect that with little kids, especially younger kids. Like, they just don't know how to control themselves. They don't know how to control their expressions as well as seasoned adults, right? But when you see it in a seasoned adult, when you see it in a 90-year-old person, man, for me, there's nothing better. There's nothing funnier. And I remember the very first time I saw my grandfather Joe's face go off. Okay? Here's what happened. As indicated earlier, I grew up in Missouri, and you started chewing when you were about 7 or 8 years old. Some of you are like, that's gross. I'm just telling you it's the case. All right? It was kind of like this rite of passage that grandma or grandpa, or I said that wrong, grandpa or grandma decided to give you. And that's true. Sometimes grandma gave you your first dip. It was just weird, all right? So anyway, everyone chewed. I'm just telling you, my entire culture, everyone chewed tobacco. It's just the case. Okay, and I know it's a gross, disgusting habit. I don't chew any longer. Mandy kicked it out of the house. I'm just kidding. I decided to go ahead and quit when I met Mandy. But what really started me thinking, I'm digressing, I'm sorry. What really started me to think that I'm going to stop chewing is when I got in a car with a girl my senior year, and I was kind of riding around with her, and I saw a can of Copenhagen in the console, and I said, is that your dad or brother's? No, that's mine. No, that's not yours. Yeah. She puts it in. I was like, okay, maybe I need to quit this stuff. Right? That's kind of when it started for me. I'm just telling you. So if you struggle with this, I completely sympathize. I understand where you're at. I can help you. I can give you some pointers on that. But regardless, Grandpa Joe and my dad had decided they were going to hold each other accountable. They decided they're going to finally kick this nasty habit. They were going to be done with it. Right? My dad had gone, I think it was 3 months. And I don't know if you've ever lived with a smoker or a chewer who's trying to quit, but man, they are irritable. Holy cow, they're irritable, right? And they want to be better. They just can't be better, it seems like, because of the addiction. And so they're really trying to work through all that stuff. We were in that season, and Dad was just grouchy. I mean, just grouchy. And so was Grandpa. I mean, there was no safe place to go. Usually when Dad and Mom's grouchy, you go to Grandma and Grandpa's house. But now it's a war zone regardless of where you go. So Dad and I walk into Grandpa's house. No joke, we see a big old line of tobacco juice right down his chin, all right? Now, Grandpa didn't have facial hair. He was barefaced, and he could shave. He shaved all the time. But he had this big old line of just chew juice right down, right? Sitting on his couch, happy as a lark. My dad walks in with me, and Dad goes, "Hey, how you doing, Joe?" "Good." "So, you doing all right?" "Yeah, I'm doing great. Life's good." "Yeah." How's the chew thing going? I mean, I've gone 3 months. How are you doing with it?" "Perfect. I haven't had a chew in 3 months." And when he discovered that he had chew juice running down his chin, you can imagine how his face goes off. So sometimes when you get caught in things, right, you got to be careful what happens with your facial expression. Sarah's in this spot. Where she just doesn't know how to react. She's kind of afraid because all of a sudden, like she learned something that she didn't know before, and then when she's called out on it, she goes, "No, I didn't." Her face goes off. It's still hidden, but her face goes off, and God knows. Now, those are the observations. Let's go right to the symbolisms, because what I think this passage does for us is it points the reader backwards. It points them back to what used to be, and in some regards, it's going to point us back to where we're going, or to where we're going. So as we walk through these symbolisms, I'm going to ask you just kind of take mental note of how this points us back. The very first one that you see on the screen is that it points us back to desired fellowship. That God initiates this interaction. God just appears, right? He appears out of nowhere. There's kind of this shock value. Abraham's scanning the landscape. He's making sure that no threats are coming in. And all of a sudden, out of nowhere, God appears. Which should really direct us back to chapter 3 of Genesis, verse 7 and 8, where it says, the Lord appeared in the cool of the morning as was his custom. Because he was used to walking with Adam and Eve. It was a daily appointment. It was a routine appointment. At the end of the day, you know what God wants from you? God wants routine appointments with you. Not because he's your doctor, not because he's your shepherd and he wants to check up. He just likes hanging out with you. He wants to be with you. And we see this. He just appears. And this is more about fellowship than it is about getting a free meal, right? This isn't about the food yet. This is just about hanging out with his kids. I remember the very first time Mandy and I were ever the guests at our children's kitchen table. I know that might sound weird because none of them have left yet. But when they were younger, when they were 7 and 8, 9 and 10, they decided they were going to have a date night with mom and dad, and they were going to cater mom and dad's meal. So Mandy and I got invitations. We showed up, dressed up at the kitchen table, and we had the worst mac and cheese I've ever had in my life. We had cold hot dogs, and we had some weird stuff to drink. I mean, it was weird, right? But you put a smile on and you fellowship with your kids, not because the food's great, because you want to be with your kids. Now, as they've aged, it's gotten better. A little bit. I'm just kidding. My kids can cook. They are very excellent cooks. And they've learned kind of a spirit of hospitality growing up in a pastor's home. But they love playing host. All of my children do. But it began at a young age. And it's not about the food for God. This is about the fellowship. This is about hanging out with his kiddos. You see, God wants to have fellowship with you. And we want to have fellowship with him. You might not think that, but it's true. Do you see what's going on with Abraham? After he serves food, he just wants to hang out with God. He doesn't give him time by himself. He just kind of stands over him. That awkward thing. It's like, I'm ready. You just tell me what you need. I'll go get it. If you don't have enough, or if it's not good enough, or you need a little salt and pepper, whatever you need, I'll do. And that's the attitude that Abraham has. See, there's a desire to have fellowship on both ends. And that points us back to creation. I'm reminded of Matthew chapter 9 and Mark chapter 2, where both Matthew and Mark indicate that Jesus ate with sinners and tax collectors. See, he wants to be with you regardless of what you've done. He knows that you're a sinner. He knows that you're a tax collector. He knows that you're rotten to the core. He knows that you've shown hostility towards him your whole life. That doesn't matter. He just wants to be with you. He wants to dine with sinners and tax collectors today. Second symbolism that I see is that God experiences the taste of death for the very first time in this passage. Which is what we did back in the garden, remember? When Eve reached for the fruit and she gave some to her husband who was with her, and they both take a bite out of the fruit. It causes death for both of them. Now, not immediate death, but they begin to die. And if anything, they start to experience loneliness and isolation and the pain and stench of sin. This is the very first time God tastes death. Here's what I mean. Did you see the passage where it said Abraham went to go choose the calf? You see, God had ordained and had designed and had created that calf to live. The same calf that he knew before it was created, that same calf, he would know that Abraham would eventually select to be slaughtered. And God eats something that's dead. It's the first time you ever taste death. So for us to have fellowship with God, something has to die, which is so weird, but so true. Because what this does is it points us to the cross. It points us back to the cross even. It helps us understand that for us to have fellowship, something had to die for you to have fellowship with God. Now, for all of my vegan and vegetarian friends, and I do have some, all right? I know that sounds weird, but I do. But for all of my vegan and vegetarian friends, let me just say this. You are always welcome at my table. We will provide food that you can eat at our home. We'll have salad and bread. We even have eggs, lots of them, okay? But we will have meat. We will have some meat at our table. So your convictions that you have that are in the freedoms of Christ, which I absolutely love, you have freedoms if you're in Christ to have whatever convictions you want to have. And you choose not to eat meat, I love you all the same. But your convictions are not my prison. I can still have liberty to eat meat. And God eats meat. This is probably the grossest thing God ever ate. Remember earlier we asked you to kind of compare what the grossest thing you ever ate was? I've had some weird food. I thought about showing you guys some pictures. I've had some weird food. And probably at the top of the list is raw liver. Yeah. As soon as a deer is harvested, one of my favorite traditions is to take a bite out of the liver. If you guys need to leave now, you can. All right. God tastes death for the very first time. Third thing that we see is a symbolism here is that there are lies that are told underneath the tree. There are lies that are told underneath the tree. We know that the serpent lied to the woman, that he was deceitful. And we know that in this situation, with Abram's tent so close, Sarah lies, which I think is just incredible. See, she's caught red-handed, her face goes off, she's afraid, and she tells a lie. And God wasn't even speaking to her. Did you see that? Go back to verse 10. The Lord said, about this time I'm going to come back to you. Sarah was listening. Abraham and Sarah were old, blah, 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 blah. Then it says in verse 13, the Lord said to Abraham. He doesn't even talk to Sarah at this point. He's not talking to Abraham. But he says to Abraham, why did Sarah laugh? She wasn't even being addressed. And Sarah's response was to lie. Because when we scoff at the work of God, when we scoff at the kingdom, we will be caught. And when we're caught, you will cower. And when you cower, you will cheat. You will lie. What I love about this, though, is that God confronts Sarah in her sin. He doesn't just ignore it. He doesn't just chalk it up as a misunderstanding. He literally says, yeah, you did. Yeah, you did, Sarah. You did lie. He doesn't let this stone go unturned. And the weird thing to me is that God doesn't even tell Sarah who the child's name will be, right? Does it say it? It doesn't at all. Right here, all it says is that you're going to have a son. But every time that she would call to her son in the future, you know what she's going to be reminded of? Is her past. Every time she calls, Isaac, food's ready. Hey, Isaac, go clean your room. Hey, Isaac, stop playing with that ant. She's going to be reminded of the laughter that she had, the scoff that she did. And she wasn't even told what his name would be. But the other thing, too, in this is that she lies underneath a tree. See, trees are significant to the whole narrative of the Bible. It comes all the way from the beginning to the end. There's the tree of life at the front end, the tree of life at the back end in Revelation, and both trees point us to the ultimate tree in the middle, which is the cross. See, something significant always happens underneath a tree. But despite her lies, God is still faithful, and he still promises a son, just like what he did in the garden. When he was speaking to the serpent, he said, there will be enmity between you and her offspring forever. You will bruise his heel. You'll get a piece of him, but his heel is going to crush your head, snake. And so there was a promise of the son in the garden, and there's a promise of the son even in this story. The symbolisms and the parallels are just too thick to go unnoticed. Not only does it point us back, but it points us to the future. It points us to what will come in the future glories. So that's our symbolism section. But what's this mean? What are the lessons that we can take away from this? To me, this is the most obvious lesson. Ministry opportunities rarely come when it's convenient. Remember what Abraham's doing? He's recovering, isn't he? He's recovering from circumcision. And he gets up and he hurries to his guests. He probably doesn't feel like being a host right now. I don't know how that hurried looks like. It doesn't say that he ran in the Hebrew. It does in the King James Version. I think the reason it doesn't say that he didn't run is because he couldn't run, right? I think he waddles over. Hey guys, how you doing? Right? I think that's kind of what's going on. But he hurries over. Hey, Logan, can we go to the next one, buddy? So, ministry opportunities rarely come when it's convenient. Okay? The second lesson that we learn in this is that we need to be ready at all times for all people. This isn't something that they weren't ready for. They were ready for all kinds of hosts to come in their transient world. They were ready for anyone to drop in. They were ready for everyone to drop in. And we've lost this ability in our world today. We don't have a pot of coffee on. We have Keurigs. We don't have water in our fridge. We have water fountains. We have lost the spirit of hospitality. I think at any given moment we should be ready to host anyone at any time. We need to really stock up. And maybe financially you can't stock up. That's okay. I was just in Aldi's the other day and I saw Ruth Lorenz, and she had bought 6 containers of cereal. I said, what are you doing with all that cereal, Ruth? Well, that's for when you come over. All right. I love it. Buy extra and buy more. Be ready anytime and every time for anyone. Third lesson in this is I believe that we should always add a little bit of ourselves to the meal. We should always add a little personal touch to the experience. Now, some of you, you're not cookers, and I get that. You don't like sitting at the kitchen. I completely understand that. But what you do like is if you don't cook, you like to go out. So take people out to your favorite restaurant. Get to know each other. Get to know each other. And then the fourth lesson for this is super easy and super simple. Don't overlook it. Don't let it get weird. Don't let it get weird. And here's what I mean by that. What I mean by that is it only got awkward with Abraham, Sarah, and the visitors when Sarah lies. You know what many of us try to do? Many of us try to put on this whole fake facade. We try to be someone that we're not. We enter deception willingly at times and maybe subconsciously, not even knowing it. But when you decide to practice this hospitality, when you decide to see ministry as not being convenient, and you're going to be ready for anyone all the time, and you decide to add your personal touches, you just need to know, don't let it get weird. The only way that it gets weird is when you're not you. So just be you. It's okay to be you. Maybe for some of you, you need to look in the mirror and say, it's okay to be me. Now, you certainly need to take into account some of your guests and some of their dietary restrictions, etc., etc. But you should always have a little touch of you. And when you do that, it won't get weird. So let me bring some real practical stuff to this. Those are the lessons that we learned. Here's the practical applications. These are going to go fast. But I'm going to ask you, if you think what I'm saying is true, if you see this scripturally as being truth, to give yourself a month to try to do what I'm asking you to do. To be ready. In 1 month's time, what happens if everyone in this church, what happens if everyone watching online decides to have a spirit of hospitality? What happens if we look intentionally for people? Because the whole thing, it starts with our eyes. We have to have great vision for people. We have to be observant. We have to look at where people are. We have to take notice. Here, let me show you something. Use your eyes to make eye contact. That's the first thing this is. Really simple, right? I know it's rocket science. Get out your notepads. This is really hard. Look at people in the eye. It's awkward at first if you've not done it. But it gets easier. And then as you look at them in the eye, here's the other thing that I think is important. Smile. Do me a favor. Turn right next to somebody and just give them a smile. Your best one. You guys are automatically happier now. We need to do this at the beginning of every service, right? It just happens. I mean, dopamine start to go through and you're like, man, life is good. Why? Because you just got to smile. You know what happens in our world today? Scowl, focused attention, resting faces. What happens if we changed our countenance? What happens if when we engaged people, not only did we make eye contact, but we tried to lift their day? What happens if we just smiled? Can you imagine a world where people just smiled? And then after that, start engaging verbally, right? Engage in conversations. This is where you take notice. You've used some of your eyes or like your vision and your ability to see people, but you take notice. Maybe they're wearing a Rams jersey. Maybe they're wearing a Rams coat. Maybe they're a scarlet letter, right, from the east side. And you go, east side, huh? I mean, whatever it is, right? So you observe people and you just make conversations. You just take notice. What happens if you started to have conversation with people? Now, one of the things I love to do is to try to make physical contact. And for guys, that's typically a handshake. And I try to do something memorable, right? I don't just, I like shaking hands, don't get me wrong. My wife and I met when we shook hands, and that's how we fell in love with each other, is because of our grip. But so be careful if I shake your hand. But you'll oftentimes see me shaking someone's hand. I did it today 4 or 5 times where I grab the wrist. Because that's how the Romans used to shake hands. They just kind of, wow, that's weird. It looks like you missed. Nope, I didn't miss. I did it on purpose. Makes it memorable. Sometimes I put a hand on a shoulder. I use the person to gauge my physical connection. Because some people are just kind of hands off, right? If you come across Nancy, you know Nancy's a hugger. She wanted to hug me the first 5 times I saw her. I was like, would you just give me a second? Gosh. But that's a condition. That's something I've developed over the years because of the ministry occupation I'm in. Some people just are not, they don't like that physical contact. And that's okay. So let them gauge the physical contact, but you can at least reach a hand out. Shake a hand at least. Make some sort of physical contact, some sort of verbal contact. Take notice. Get people talking about themselves. Now, one of the things I've tried to do is just create 1 or 2 or 3 introductions and sign-offs that I just know I'm going to go to, right? So if I'm wanting to practice hospitality and I've just met a stranger, I might say, hey, do you have lunch plans? Can I take you out to lunch? That might be one of my go-tos I'm going to try to get to. If it doesn't work out, you know what I try to do, at least end with? Would you mind if I prayed with you? And I'll literally put my hand on their shoulder and I'll pray for them. This happened this last week in Aldi's, and it wasn't with Ruth Lorenz either. It was with some other lady. She was fighting some boxes and some things were going on. She was really frustrated, and she goes, man, why today? And that's what she said as I walked by. I took notice. I was like, okay, she's in a bad spot. I came and brought Mandy what we had purchased, put him in the cart, and I said, I'll be right back. I went back around the corner, and I said, ma'am, I don't mean to scare you. I know I'm scary sometimes, so I kind of have to lead with that, all right? I don't mean to scare you. I couldn't help but notice you're having a rough day. Would you mind if I prayed with you right now? And she just tears instantly. So I put my hand on her shoulder and I just pray a blessing over her. That's all I do. That's hospitality. I'm not going to take that woman out to lunch because I'm married, right? Unless Mandy and I do that together. But if there are guys, I'll often take them out to lunch just because it's a spirit of hospitality. So that's the third thing, is taking them out to lunch, right? Find a way to eat with them. I love Andrew Zimmerman's Bizarre Foods channel. I love that. At the beginning of the show, he says this. I wrote it down. I wanted to make sure I got it right. I believe sharing food is one of the best ways to experience other cultures. I believe sharing food is the best way to experience other cultures. So when you take someone out to eat, this is your personal touch. Take them to your favorite restaurant, bring them in for your own home. Whatever you do, make sure that there's an abundance of food. One thing that we saw here in chapter 18 is that Abraham told Sarah to get 3 seahs of flour. That's 22 quarts of flour. That's 3 times the normal requirement for a Jewish woman to make food in her home. So basically what you saw there is she made 11 loaves of bread for that one lunch. She made enough that they could take it home if they wanted to. Make an abundance of it. But this provides relational contact. So now you've got your visual, your physical, your verbal, and now you've got your relational. And finally, live on the edge. Take a risk. I've already said it. This is not about having people over who are your friends and family. That's not what we're talking about with hospitality. This is about literally love for strangers. The Greek word for hospitality is love for strangers. Phileo for strangers. Okay, brotherly love for strangers. You see, sin not only separates us from God, it also separates us from each other. That's why some of us like to run in our own little holes. So for us to practice hospitality in a world that's hostile, man, that's a rich characteristic of the kingdom. See, Jesus moves towards those types of people who are on the edge. He moves towards the different. He moves towards the stranger. He moves towards the weird. And you know how I know that? Because he moved towards me. And he's moving towards you. You're on the edge. And so for us to practice the spirit of hospitality, if you're a believer, is to be like Jesus. See, Jesus extends, this is the thing I want you to remember. Jesus extends hospitality to us regardless of how we've been hostile towards him. Our hostility did not eliminate his hospitality. So, we love the outsider because we were first the outsider. That's what it's all about. And you know, who knows? Maybe as you do this, as you practice some of these things, you might find a friend or two. Here's the weird one. You might entertain an angel or two. The question, are you showing love? Are you showing love to people on the edge? Father, I pray right now that you would speak to us, that you would change us, that you would motivate us, that you would make us uncomfortable, that you would move us out of our places of complacency, that we would reach out to those on the edge, because you reached out to us.
Time just keeps rolling on while I'm here, stuck like glue. So many things cross my mind, but nothing stays a while. So frustrating, I just wanna say something worthwhile. Speak through me and say what you wanna say. Say it loudly, say what you wanna say. 6:45 a.m., man, that just can't be right. 3 hours have gone by and this is all I've got. My common sense tells me I should get out the way. So you can speak, oh Lord, show up or I'll be here all day. Speak through me and say what you wanna say. Say it loudly, say what you wanna say. Speak through me, yeah. If the end is mine, it's nothing but a waste of time. So won't you say what you wanna say. Say what you wanna say.